When Americans think of tropical paradise, they picture crystal clear waters, swaying palm trees, and endless possibilities for a fresh start. But sometimes what looks like paradise on the surface can hide something much darker underneath. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked investigators across 2 countries and revealed just how far someone will go to cover up the truth. This is the story of Devil's Island, where the American dream turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the autumn of 2011, a young American couple arrived on the remote Caribbean islands of Panama with hopes of starting their new life together. Yvonne Baldelli, recently divorced and looking for adventure, had fallen head over heels for Brian Bermager, a decorated former Marine who seemed to have everything going for him. Brian had served 7 years in the Marine Corps, stationed in Washington, D.C., as part of the Honor Guard. There were even photographs of him standing in the White House alongside President George W. Bush. From the outside looking in, this guy had the perfect all-American persona that would make any woman's heart skip a beat. After completing his military service, Brian decided he needed to decompress and find his next chapter. Panama seemed like the ideal place to do exactly that. The cost of living was incredibly low, the beaches were pristine, and for someone with musical aspirations like Brian, the local bar scene offered plenty of opportunities to perform. Yvonne was absolutely smitten with this man. She saw him as her Prince Charming, the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. When Brian suggested they pack up everything and move to Panama together, she didn't hesitate for a second. Michelle Valenzuela, Yvonne's sister, watched as her sibling threw herself completely into this relationship. Yvonne was the type of person who gave 100% of herself when she fell in love, and she expected that same level of commitment in return. But Michelle had her reservations about Brian from the very beginning, despite her concerns. Yvonne was determined to make this work. She brought 2 sewing machines with her to Panama, planning to start a clothing business making bathing suits for tourists. With her beloved dog, Georgia May, by her side, she was ready to build the life she'd always dreamed of. The couple settled on Isla Carnero in Bocas del Toro, a small island community where expats from around the world came to escape their old lives. They rented a house right on the water, and Brian quickly became a fixture at the local bars, playing guitar and singing for food and drinks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent regular emails home to her family, painting a picture of tropical bliss. She described their morning runs on the beach, swimming in the crystal-clear ocean, and the excitement of building something new together in paradise. The local expat community welcomed them with open arms. Bar owners let Brian perform in exchange for meals and free alcohol. Yvonne seemed genuinely happy, and to anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a couple living their best life. But beneath the surface, cracks were already starting to show. Brian's drinking was becoming more and more problematic. What started as a few beers after performances turned into heavy drinking sessions that lasted well into the night. Some locals noticed that his musical abilities seemed to deteriorate the more he drank, describing his intoxicated singing voice as resembling a hound dog on a porch. More concerning were the signs of trouble in paradise that some observant neighbors began to notice. There were reports of loud arguments coming from their house, and on at least one occasion, locals saw bruises on Yvonne's face that she tried desperately to hide. Despite these warning signs, Yvonne's family back in the United States remained optimistic about the relationship. Her emails continued to arrive regularly, filled with stories of their tropical adventures. Her father, Jim Faust, could picture every detail of their new life based on her vivid descriptions. He genuinely believed that Brian might be the one for his daughter. But then, around Thanksgiving 2011, something changed. The frequent, cheerful emails from Yvonne began to slow down. Michelle noticed immediately that the communication pattern had shifted, and her sisterly instincts started kicking in. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Yvonne. Finally, on December 14th, Michelle received a text message from an unknown number. It wasn't from Yvonne at all, but from Brian, asking to make arrangements to pick up his truck that he'd left at Michelle's house in California. When Michelle called the number, Brian calmly explained that he and Yvonne were no longer together. He claimed they'd gotten into a fight because she'd discovered he had a child from a previous relationship, something he'd never mentioned before. According to Brian, Yvonne had simply packed up and left without a word. This revelation was devastating for Yvonne, who was unable to have children due to a medical condition. Learning that the man she'd sacrificed everything for had been hiding the existence of his own child would have been absolutely earth-shattering. But Michelle wasn't buying Brian's story. When she suggested they go to the police together to file a missing persons report, since he was the last person to see Yvonne, Brian seemed reluctant to get involved. That's when Michelle decided to dig deeper into her email account, where she discovered a message she'd previously overlooked. It was from Yvonne herself, sent shortly after Brian's call, explaining that she and Brian had broken up and that she was headed to Costa Rica with a man she'd met when they first arrived in Panama. The email described Brian as a lying, cheating individual and claimed that Yvonne should have trusted her instincts about him from the beginning. While the message provided some explanation for what had happened, something about it didn't sit right with Michelle. The timing seemed off, and certain phrases in the email just didn't sound like something her sister would say. Yvonne had never been the type to run off impulsively with someone she barely knew, especially after such a traumatic discovery about Brian's secret child. 3 weeks later, another email arrived from Yvonne, this time saying she was getting homesick and making plans to return home by the second week of January. She mentioned she'd been staying with someone and was looking forward to seeing everyone again. This second email provided some comfort to the family, who assumed Yvonne would show up at their planned family gathering in January. But when that reunion came and went without any sign of Yvonne, Michelle knew something was terribly wrong. Her father, Jim, shared her concerns. After decades of knowing his daughter, he was certain that Yvonne would never simply disappear without maintaining contact with her family. She was too responsible, too caring, and too connected to the people she loved to just vanish into thin air. That's when Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands and investigate further. She reached out to a tech-savvy cousin who could trace the IP addresses of the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne from Panama and Costa Rica. What they discovered would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark truth about what really happened on Devil's Island. The cousin's investigation revealed something that sent chills down Michelle's spine. The emails that were supposedly sent from Panama showed IP addresses consistent with that location. But the email claiming Yvonne was in Costa Rica, living with another man, showed an IP address from Dana Point, California, exactly where Brian was now living. This meant that someone had been using Yvonne's email account to impersonate her, sending messages to her family from Brian's computer in the United States. The realization hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Her sister wasn't hiding out in Costa Rica with some mysterious new boyfriend. Someone had been playing an elaborate game of deception, and that someone was Brian Brimmager. With this damning evidence in hand, Michelle knew she had to act fast. She contacted the FBI, where she met with Special Agent Andrew Masters, a seasoned investigator who immediately recognized the significance of what Michelle had uncovered. The IP address evidence was a smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that foul play was involved. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Yvonne's disappearance, with Masters taking the lead. They contacted the State Department to check immigration records, which confirmed what Yvonne's family had suspected all along. There was no record of her ever leaving Panama or entering Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Yvonne's family couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. They decided to take matters into their own hands and travel to Panama to search for answers themselves. They connected with Don Winner, a legendary investigator and former U.S. intelligence officer who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases in Central America. Winner was known throughout Panama as the person to call when bad things happened to American citizens. He'd already helped put away 3 serial killers and had an uncanny ability to crack the most complex murder cases. When he heard Yvonne's story, he immediately knew they were dealing with something sinister. His assessment was blunt and chilling. The chances that Yvonne was running around Costa Rica with some other man were essentially zero. Winner believed they were looking at a murder case, and Brian Brimmager was their prime suspect. Back in the United States, the FBI was putting pressure on Brian, conducting surveillance and building their case. They discovered that within weeks of Yvonne's disappearance, Brian had not only returned to California, but had gotten engaged and married to Kristen Verkhoven, a woman he'd met while she was working at the White House. The timeline was shocking. Brian had proposed to Kristen just days after Yvonne disappeared in Panama. Wedding photos showed a couple that appeared blissfully happy, completely unaware of the dark secret that lurked beneath Brian's charming exterior. What made this revelation even more disturbing was that Kristen was the mother of Brian's secret child, the very discovery that had allegedly caused the final fight between Brian and Yvonne. Brian had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with 2 women simultaneously, neither fully aware of the other's existence. In Panama, Winner organized a press conference with local authorities to publicize Yvonne's disappearance and put pressure on anyone who might have information. For the first time, Panamanian police officially declared that Yvonne was the victim of foul play and named Brian Brimmager as their primary suspect. The press conference sent shockwaves around the world. Here was a decorated former Marine, someone who had served his country with honor and stood in the White House with the president, now being accused of murdering his girlfriend in a tropical paradise. As news of the case spread, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing accounts of Brian and Yvonne's relationship. Local bar owners and residents described a pattern of verbal and physical abuse that painted a very different picture from the happy couple Yvonne had portrayed in her emails home. One bar owner recalled seeing Yvonne with black eyes and bruises around her face. When asked about her injuries, she tried to hide them and refused to discuss what had happened. The revelation that Brian had been physically abusing Yvonne was devastating for her family, who had no idea she was suffering in silence. Jeff Salzman, who owned one of the local establishments where Brian performed, described him as a scary person who he didn't want to be around. The image of the clean-cut, all-American Marine was crumbling as more and more people shared their experiences with the couple. Yvonne's family organized search parties to comb through the dense jungle and swampland surrounding the island where she'd disappeared. The terrain was brutal. Thick tropical vegetation filled with spiders, snakes, and every kind of dangerous creature imaginable. The water was murky and rancid, making it nearly impossible to see anything beneath the surface, despite the challenging conditions. Volunteers joined the family in their desperate search for any trace of Yvonne. They found various items, a purse, medicine bottles, even a U.S. passport. But none belonged to Yvonne. Each discovery raised hopes only to dash them moments later. The search was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Lauren Beyer, Yvonne's niece, found herself in the heartbreaking position of hoping to find her aunt, while simultaneously dreading what that discovery might look like after so much time had passed. Back in California, the FBI was closing in on Brian Brimmager. Agent Masters had obtained a warrant to search Brian's residence, where he made a crucial discovery. Sitting on a table in Brian's living room was a white Sony Vaio laptop computer, the exact same type of computer that Yvonne had taken with her to Panama. When Masters saw the laptop, he immediately suspected it belonged to Yvonne. His instincts proved correct. The computer contained a wealth of evidence that would ultimately help unravel the mystery of what happened on that remote Caribbean island. The laptop revealed Brian's internet search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the days following Yvonne's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for information about removing blood from mattresses and other incriminating queries that suggested someone was trying to cover up a violent crime. Perhaps most damning of all, the computer contained evidence that Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to send those fake messages to her family. The digital trail clearly showed that the emails claiming she was alive and well in Costa Rica had actually been composed and sent from Brian's residence in California. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Brian had been using Yvonne's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts after her disappearance. ATM surveillance footage captured him making these transactions, providing visual proof that he was accessing her finances while letting her family believe she was safe. As the evidence mounted against him, Brian Brimmager continued to maintain his innocence and live his new life as if nothing had happened. He spent his days playing golf, caring for his young daughter, and enjoying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that his new marriage provided. But the FBI wasn't about to let him escape justice. They were building an airtight case, piece by piece, that would eventually bring him to account for what investigators believed was a carefully planned and executed murder in paradise. In 2013, nearly 2 years after Yvonne had vanished without a trace, the FBI finally made their move. Special Agent Andrew Masters approached Brian Brimmager's apartment with handcuffs in hand, ready to end this elaborate charade once and for all. When Masters knocked on the door, Brian answered and invited him inside, claiming he'd been expecting this visit. For more than 4 hours, while Brian casually babysat his young daughter, Masters grilled him about the inconsistencies in his story and the mounting evidence against him. Brian continued to stick to his original narrative. He insisted that Yvonne had left him for another man, that she'd gone to Costa Rica willingly, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the IP address evidence and the fact that her supposed emails from Costa Rica were actually sent from his computer, Brian began to stumble. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were starting to show in his carefully constructed facade. Masters could see the doubt creeping into Brian's eyes as the evidence piled up against him. But even then, this former Marine refused to break. Brian was arrested and charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne's death. However, without a body, prosecutors couldn't yet bring murder charges. That would all change in the most dramatic way possible. In June 2013, a local worker clearing brush on the very island where Brian and Yvonne had lived made a discovery that would finally bring closure to this tragic case. Hidden in the dense jungle, just a few hundred yards from where Yvonne's family had spent days searching, he found a duffel bag. When the worker unbuckled the clasp and looked inside, he discovered Yvonne's skeletonized remains. After 2 years in the tropical elements, only bones remained of the vibrant young woman who had come to Panama with such hope and excitement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Yvonne Baldelli, and her remains told a horrific story of what had really happened in paradise. The autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered, most likely after being stabbed in the back at least twice. The discovery of Yvonne's body allowed prosecutors to finally bring murder charges against Brian Brimmiger. But for Michelle Valenzuela, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her sister, time was running out in her own battle for survival. Michelle had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and doctors gave her just weeks to live. Despite her deteriorating condition, she was determined to see this case through to the end. In what would be one of her final acts of love for her sister, Michelle agreed to give crucial testimony while she still could. The courtroom scene was heartbreaking. Michelle, weakened by cancer but fueled by determination, sat directly across from Brian Brimmiger and told the world about her sister's disappearance. She pointed him out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had destroyed her family. The testimony was exhausting, and Michelle collapsed afterward from the strain. But she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her words would be preserved forever, ensuring that Yvonne's story would be told and that justice would prevail. Days later, Michelle passed away, having given everything she had to find the truth about what happened to her beloved sister. Meanwhile, investigators made another breakthrough that would seal Brian's fate. Remember that machete he had sold on Facebook after Yvonne's disappearance? The one he had joked about using to chop up one stripper. The FBI had tracked it down and subjected it to advanced forensic testing. While Brian had cleaned the blade thoroughly, he had missed something crucial. When investigators removed the handle, they found Yvonne's blood and DNA trapped underneath, where no amount of cleaning could reach it. This was the smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that this weapon had been used to dismember her body. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Brian Brimmiger's house of lies finally collapsed. His lawyers advised him that fighting these charges would be futile, and in early 2016 he finally admitted defeat. In a dramatic reversal, Brian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. After nearly 5 years of lies, manipulation, and deception, he finally admitted in open court that he had killed Yvonne Baldelli. He offered an apology to her family, but his words rang hollow after everything he had put them through. The judge sentenced Brian Brimmiger to 26 years in federal prison. For a man who had once stood in the White House as an honored Marine, this was a spectacular fall from grace. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, paying for the terrible crime he committed in paradise. With the case finally resolved, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family for a proper burial. In a touching ceremony, they laid her to rest at sea, knowing that she loved the ocean and would finally be at peace in the waters she had found so beautiful. The case of Devil's Island serves as a chilling reminder that paradise can quickly turn into hell when dangerous people are involved. Yvonne Baldelli went to Panama looking for love and adventure, but instead found herself trapped with a man capable of unthinkable violence. Brian Brimmiger's ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, decorated Marine, loving husband, and cold-blooded killer, shows how easily predators can hide among us. His wife, Kristen, continues to support him and visit him in prison, apparently still believing in his innocence despite his guilty plea. The real heroes of this story are the family members who never gave up searching for the truth. Michelle Valenzuela's determination to find justice for her sister, even while battling terminal cancer, demonstrates the power of love and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Today, Brian Brimmiger sits in federal prison, where he will remain until 2037. The tropical paradise of Panama continues to attract visitors from around the world, but for those who knew Yvonne Baldelli, the islands will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened there. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the most respectable facades. A military uniform, a charming smile, and an all-American persona can mask the darkest of intentions. And sometimes, what looks like paradise from the outside can be nothing more than Devil's Island in disguise. The morning sky churned with an ominous darkness that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in one woman's life. Crystal McDowell had no idea that August 25, 2017 would be the last day anyone would see her alive, as Hurricane Harvey barreled toward the Texas coast. Crystal made a decision that would change everything. She left her home that Friday morning, walking into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. This isn't just another missing person case. This is a story where nature's fury collided with human deception, where floodwaters would wash away evidence and complicate an investigation that already had more twists than anyone could imagine. By the time the storm passed, investigators would realize they weren't just fighting against time and weather. They were up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would be the perfect cover. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Crystal McDowell's disappearance, a case that would expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary life. 3 men would emerge as suspects. One would ultimately face justice, but the path to that courtroom would be anything but straightforward. Crystal McDowell was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Those who knew her described a woman with an infectious spirit, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life and wasn't afraid to go after it. She had built a successful career as a flight attendant, traveling the world and embracing what friends called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, Crystal had traded the skies for real estate, diving headfirst into a new chapter of her professional life. At 43, Crystal was a mother to 2 children, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. She was also navigating the complexities of post-divorce life. Her marriage to Steve McDowell had officially ended just months earlier in June 2017 after 10 years together. What many described as an amicable split had left Crystal in an unusual living arrangement. She was staying in the master bedroom of the house she had helped Steve purchase, while he had moved upstairs to a different room. It was temporary, they said, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was complete. But beneath this seemingly peaceful coexistence, there were undercurrents that few people fully understood. Crystal had recently begun dating Paul Hargrave, a local jewelry store owner. Their relationship was still new, just a few weeks old, but Crystal seemed genuinely happy. So happy, in fact, that she had posted on social media just days before her disappearance, declaring she had never been happier in her entire life. The timing of Crystal's vanishing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury. Weather forecasters were predicting catastrophic flooding, and residents across the region were making final preparations for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Grocery store shelves had been stripped bare. Gas stations were running dry. Everyone who could leave had already evacuated. Crystal, however, had chosen to stay. She had responsibilities, people who depended on her. As a newly licensed real estate agent, she had clients to consider. As a mother, she had children to protect. The storm was supposed to last several days, and Crystal wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started like any other. Crystal sent text messages to Paul, her new boyfriend. They exchanged their usual good morning pleasantries, making plans for when the storm passed. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. Paul replied to Crystal's messages, but she never responded back. At first, he assumed she was simply busy preparing for the hurricane. Everyone was scrambling to secure their homes and gather supplies, but Crystal's silence was completely out of character. She was the type of person who stayed in constant communication with the people she cared about. Her uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old, received messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her life, her work, her children. Jeff described his niece as one of the most responsible people he had ever known. Crystal never lost contact with her family. As Friday turned into Saturday, concern began to mount. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain across southeast Texas. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was taking a direct hit. Streets were flooding, power lines were down, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult. But even accounting for the chaos of the hurricane, Crystal's complete radio silence was alarming. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to have arrived at their house on Friday morning. He claimed she had sent him a text message at 7:01 that morning, saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message suggested she might stay with him and the children since it looked like the storm would be severe. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff became increasingly worried as Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal. He began reaching out to relatives and friends, trying to piece together Crystal's last known movements. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Multiple people told him the same thing, they just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her children needed her. The timing was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint. Hurricane Harvey was wreaking havoc across the entire region. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while simultaneously trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, yet they still showed up for work every single day, determined to find Crystal McDowell. District Attorney Cheryl Leek would later describe the challenges they faced. The flooding was so severe that normal investigative procedures became nearly impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was compromised, transportation was limited. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, law enforcement remained committed to finding Crystal. They understood something that Crystal's family already knew. Mothers don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their children need them most. As the floodwaters began to recede, investigators started to piece together a timeline of Crystal's final days. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. Though there was one complication, her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This detail would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Paul had expressed concern about the awkwardness of joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if Steve could perhaps skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal had approached Steve about not attending the cruise, and Steve's reaction had been intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he had apparently viewed as an opportunity to reconcile with Crystal. The investigation was further complicated by Crystal's extensive social circle. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she knew people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, someone who maintained friendships from every chapter of her life. This meant that investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to verify. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband who still shared a home with Crystal and seemed to harbor hopes of reconciliation. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend who had been one of the last people to see Crystal alive. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had begun to raise questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each claimed to want nothing more than to see her returned safely. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The discovery of Crystal's abandoned Mercedes in a motel parking lot would mark the beginning of the end of this tragic mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While law enforcement was struggling against flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's own family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal frequented, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. It was this intimate knowledge that led them to the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6, its doors unlocked, and keys resting conspicuously on the center console. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. In his years of law enforcement experience, he had never encountered an abandoned vehicle staged so obviously. Everything about the scene screamed setup. The car's placement seemed almost theatrical. It was positioned in plain sight, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. But whoever had left it there hadn't anticipated the massive flooding that Harvey would bring. The rising waters had trapped the Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had likely been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented unique challenges. The flood damage had contaminated potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane-related problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, yet they continued working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies began canvassing nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have captured whoever had abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was painstaking work made even more difficult by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had suffered flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline. But investigators persevered, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they discovered footage from a Shell gas station adjacent to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure emerging from what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash receptacle. The person seemed to be disposing of something, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept glancing toward the motel, as if checking to ensure the car was still where it had been left. The footage was far from perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure bore a strong resemblance to Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with. But Steve wasn't making things easy for law enforcement. When brought in for questioning, he maintained his story that Crystal had never arrived at his house that Friday morning. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to her and volunteered to help with the investigation in any way possible. His demeanor was cooperative, even friendly, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Polygraph tests were administered to both Steve and Paul Hargrave. The results were revealing. While Paul's test results were inconclusive, Steve failed his examination decisively. When confronted with these results, Steve's attorney advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. The friendly, helpful ex-husband suddenly became evasive and defensive. Meanwhile, investigators were learning more about the dynamics of Crystal and Steve's relationship. What had been described as an amicable divorce was actually far more complicated. Family members revealed that Steve had never truly accepted the end of their marriage. He harbored fantasies about reconciliation and had been devastated when Crystal began dating someone else. Crystal's Aunt Cindy provided crucial insights into Steve's behavior. She described how he would cater to Crystal's every need, rubbing her feet when she was tired, brushing her hair when she asked. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Crystal's independence had been gradually eroding under the weight of his neediness. When Crystal finally decided to end their marriage, Steve's world had collapsed. The upcoming family cruise had taken on enormous significance in Steve's mind. He had apparently purchased matching white outfits for himself and Crystal, planning to propose to her during the trip. In his fantasy, they would remarry and start fresh. When Crystal uninvited him from the cruise to make room for her new boyfriend, it shattered his delusions about their future together. Financial pressures were also mounting in Steve's life. Crystal had been his primary source of financial support, and she had recently decided to cut him off. Friends described how Steve had been spending money recklessly, making purchases he couldn't afford, while Crystal covered his expenses. When she finally said she couldn't continue supporting his lifestyle, Steve faced the loss of not just his ex-wife, but his entire way of life. The investigation took another crucial turn when deputies discovered additional surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. This video showed Steve purchasing a bicycle on the day Crystal disappeared. The timing was significant because it provided a potential explanation for how Steve had gotten home after abandoning Crystal's car at the motel. The bicycle purchase occurred after Crystal's Mercedes had been spotted at the motel, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. Investigators were building a compelling circumstantial case, but they still lacked the direct evidence needed to make an arrest. Steve seemed to understand this, growing more confident and arrogant with each passing day. He would arrive at the sheriff's office for questioning and sit for hours, calmly denying any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. His attitude suggested he believed he was untouchable. The psychological pressure was mounting on all sides. District Attorney Cheryl Leak knew Steve was guilty, but struggled with the knowledge that knowing something and proving it in court were two very different challenges. The case was consuming enormous resources, and the community was demanding answers. Meanwhile, Steve retained custody of his and Crystal's two young children, a situation that made everyone uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they needed to apply different pressure to Steve. Rather than continuing to focus solely on gathering evidence, they decided to remove the children from his care. Working with Family Protective Services, they arranged for Madden and Maui to be placed with Crystal's Aunt Cindy. The psychological impact on Steve was immediate and devastating. Losing custody of the children represented Steve's final connection to his old life. Without Crystal and without the kids, he had nothing left to lose. Investigators hoped this realization would finally break through his defenses and lead to a confession. They were betting everything on the theory that a man with nothing left to protect might finally tell the truth. The gamble was risky. If Steve decided to run or harm himself, they would lose their only real suspect and any chance of finding Crystal's body. But Sheriff Hawthorne made the difficult decision to allow Steve to go home one final time, giving him the night to consider his options. It was an unprecedented move that would either solve the case or let a killer escape justice forever. The night Steve spent at home would prove to be his last as a free man. Early the next morning, he called his daughter Krista, who was attending Texas A&M University, asking her to come home immediately. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When Krista arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, she found her father in a state she had never seen before. Steve was methodical that morning, almost businesslike as he handed over photo albums, financial documents, and even the keys to his prized Mustang to Krista. It seemed like her father was simply trying to get his affairs in order before facing whatever consequences awaited him. She had defended him throughout the investigation, believing completely in his innocence. But then the conversation took a chilling turn. Steve looked at his daughter and said something that would haunt her forever. He mentioned that investigators had told him they would reduce his punishment if he revealed where Crystal's body was located. When Krista protested that he couldn't possibly know such information, Steve's response was devastating. He looked away and broke down completely. In that moment, Krista realized the horrible truth. Her father knew exactly where Crystal McDowell was because he had put her there. The man she had defended, the father she had loved and trusted, was a killer. When police arrived to take Steve into custody, Krista collapsed to her knees and wept. At the sheriff's office, Steve finally began to talk. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came nonetheless. He described how Crystal had returned home that Friday morning after spending the night with Paul. An argument had erupted immediately. Steve was furious that she had stayed out all night, devastated by her obvious happiness with another man. In his statement, Steve claimed that Crystal had become aggressive during their confrontation. He said she didn't love him anymore, that she had made that abundantly clear. But investigators believed the truth was simpler and more sinister. Steve McDowell had made a calculated decision. If he couldn't have Crystal, nobody could. The details Steve provided were horrific. He described strangling Crystal from behind, catching her completely off guard. She had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to fight back. After killing the mother of his children, Steve had methodically disposed of her body, wrapping it in trash bags before driving to a remote wooded area. Steve led investigators to the location where he had dumped Crystal's remains. The site was densely wooded and difficult to access, chosen specifically because Steve believed it would never be discovered. Recovery efforts were complicated by the thick vegetation and the decomposition that had occurred during the weeks since Crystal's murder. When Crystal's body was finally recovered, the case officially became a homicide prosecution. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with murder, ending months of speculation and bringing some measure of closure to Crystal's devastated family. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of Steve's deception and obsession. Despite his confession, he attempted to claim that Crystal's death had been accidental, the result of what he described as a spontaneous embrace that had gotten out of control. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 days of testimony and evidence, it took the jury less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. Steve McDowell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2042 when he is in his 70s. The tragedy extended far beyond Crystal's death. 2 young children had lost both parents, their mother to murder, their father to prison. 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui would grow up knowing the devastating truth about how their family had been destroyed. Crystal McDowell's story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the facade of even the most seemingly normal relationships. Her death occurred during one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. But the real storm had been brewing in her own home for years. Hurricane Harvey eventually passed, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and forever changing the Texas Gulf Coast. But for Crystal's family and friends, the storm's most devastating casualty was a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Today, Crystal's children are thriving under the care of family friends who have provided them with the stability and love they deserve. They carry their mother's memory with them, remembering her infectious spirit and her determination to always do what was right. This case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite flooded crime labs, damaged evidence, and personal losses from the hurricane, they persevered until justice was served. Crystal McDowell's story didn't end with Hurricane Harvey, but her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the children she loved more than anything in the world. Caitlin Hunt was born on August 14, 1994 in Sebastian, Florida, a small, peaceful coastal town in Indian River County. Her family was well known locally, not for wealth or social influence, but because they were active members of the community, often seen at school events, youth sports activities, and local businesses. Caitlin, affectionately known as Kate, grew up in a family that valued self-expression, individuality, and loyalty. Caitlin's family is middle class, characterized by a tradition of hard work and emotional openness. Her father, Stephen, worked in trades and maintenance, while her mother, Kelly, owned a salon and had a strong, protective nature. Caitlin has an older sister, and the relationship between the two is both close and deep, like best friends, and tinged with the usual sibling rivalry. Their family life is always busy and sometimes quite lively, with cozy meals and heartfelt moments, all of which have nurtured and shaped Caitlin into an honest, strong, and opinionated person from a young age. Caitlin stood out for her vibrant personality. She was energetic, outgoing, and unafraid to express her thoughts. Teachers described her as confident, curious, and assertive, often questioning things instead of blindly agreeing. She had a strong sense of fairness and often stood up for kids who were excluded or bullied. On the playground, she naturally took the lead, and in the classroom, while she sometimes got in trouble for talking too much, it was never for being disrespectful. In middle school, Caitlin's character developed further. She became more self-aware, driven, and sensitive to social dynamics. Her friend group was diverse, including athletes, artists, musicians, and those who didn't fit into specific categories. Caitlin gravitated toward people who were unique and made it a point to ensure they felt accepted. As she explored her own identity, she was known for being open and emotionally available, someone her friends could confide in without hesitation. When it came to her own story, Caitlin stayed honest and true to herself. By high school, Caitlin had truly come into her own. At Sebastian River High School, she was a familiar and well-liked presence. She cheered on the school's teams as a cheerleader, played varsity basketball, participated in pep rallies, joined the choir, and kept up with a full academic schedule. Outside of school, Caitlin worked at a smoothie shop and spent her free time enjoying music, going to the beach, and hanging out with her close-knit group of friends. She was active on social media, but her posts reflected her personality, focused on humor, friendship, and the joys of everyday teenage life in Florida. She wasn't flashy or attention-seeking. Instead, she valued genuine relationships and kept her circle tight. At home, Caitlin held on to her family's values. Her parents, though firm in some ways, gave her the space she needed to grow and develop her own ideals. The Hunt family was outspoken about their beliefs, whether this meant supporting their daughter's dreams, guarding their privacy, or standing up to criticism. Caitlin inherited this strength. She was resilient, uninterested in small talk or blending in, and unapologetically herself. Caitlin's openness about her sexuality was just another facet of who she was. She didn't treat it as a statement or a cause. It was simply part of her life. She dated openly during high school and never felt the need to hide her feelings. There were no big announcements or dramatic declarations, just a quiet, natural acceptance of her identity. Her classmates, teachers, and family were all aware, and it didn't faze her. For her, it was simply the truth. By her senior year in 2012 to 2013, Caitlin was preparing to graduate and plan her future beyond Sebastian River High School. She was interested in pursuing a career in healthcare, possibly in nursing or sports medicine, and was actively exploring college options. Caitlin had solid grades, was involved in extracurricular activities, and had stable relationships with those around her. She was in a position many teenagers aspire to. Her parents trusted her. She was respected at school, and she felt hopeful about the future. To others, Caitlin seemed like a teenager with a promising path ahead, a mix of discipline and independence, passion and playfulness. Like many young people, she was sometimes impulsive and didn't always think about how her actions might be perceived. However, she was also thoughtful and determined. Her high school life was similar to that of many others, busy, emotional, filled with milestones and uncertainties. Caitlin wasn't perfect, nor did she claim to be. She was simply a real 18 years old navigating the transition between adolescence and adulthood. What no one could have predicted was how quickly her life would change and how far-reaching the consequences of one relationship would become. In early 2013, Caitlin, a senior at Sebastian River High School, was finishing up her final months of high school. She was active in sports, participated in choir, and preparing to graduate, beneath the surface of her seemingly routine teenage life. However, a personal relationship had developed that would soon lead to a legal and public controversy. Caitlin had entered into a relationship with a 14-year-old freshman girl at her school, who was in her first year of high school. Their connection reportedly began through mutual friends and shared activities, and evolved from friendship into a more intimate relationship. To Caitlin and those close to her, the relationship appeared to be consensual, affectionate, and typical of young people exploring romance and identity. However, the law in Florida viewed it differently. Florida law is clear regarding age and consent. The legal age of consent in the state is 16. Any intimate activity involving an adult, someone 18 or older, and someone under 16 is classified as a felony, regardless of perceived consent or emotional ties. Caitlin had just turned 18 just months before the relationship turned physical, while her girlfriend was still legally a minor. The situation came to light when the younger girl's parents discovered social media exchanges and messages on their daughter's phone. They confronted their daughter, who confirmed the nature of the relationship, including its emotional and physical aspects. Alarmed by the age difference and concerned about their daughter's well-being, the parents took action. They informed the school and later filed a formal complaint with the Indian River County Sheriff's Office. As a result, law enforcement launched an investigation. Detectives interviewed the younger student and collected digital evidence, including thousands of text messages, Facebook chats, call logs, and other communications between the two young women. According to police reports, the younger girl admitted the relationship had included physical contact on at least 2 occasions, once in a school restroom and once in a car parked on school grounds. These details were critical to the investigation, As they established a timeline and location falling under state criminal law, Caitlin was contacted by authorities and questioned. She admitted to the relationship and confirmed several details about what had occurred. In her view, the relationship had been consensual and free of abuse or exploitation. She believed it was based on mutual feelings rather than manipulation or coercion. However, her own statements and the digital evidence gathered were used to support charges against her. On February 16, 2013, Caitlin was arrested at her home and charged with 2 felony counts child abuse between the ages of 12 and 16. The arrest shocked Caitlin's community and devastated her family, who saw the relationship as a consensual teenage romance rather than a criminal act. The charges could result in up to 15 years in prison and mandatory registration as a predator. Caitlin's parents immediately protested the charges, arguing that the case was not just about age, but also about discrimination. They believe Caitlin's gender played a significant role in the prosecution, and that if she had been male in a relationship with a younger woman, the case may have been handled differently or dismissed. They pointed to Florida's Romeo and Juliet law, which offers legal relief for close-in-age relationships, and highlighted other similar cases where leniency had been granted. The case quickly gained attention beyond Indian River County. Drawing national media coverage, Caitlin's family began a campaign under the hashtag #FreeKate, advocating for the charges against her to be dropped or reduced. Their online petition quickly garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Supporters nationwide, including civil rights activists, attorneys, and public figures, joined the conversation, arguing that the prosecution represented a miscarriage of justice. As public debate intensified, the legal process continued. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and proposed a plea deal to Caitlin, in exchange for pleading guilty or no contest to lesser charges. She would avoid prison time and offender status for abuse, but instead serve house arrest and probation. A key condition of the deal required Caitlin to cease all contact with the victim in order to protect the younger girl and maintain the integrity of the case. Initially, Caitlin declined the plea deal. Her legal team hoped media pressure would lead the state attorney's office to reconsider or drop the charges, arguing that the relationship was a case of misguided but mutual teenage behavior, not a predatory felony act. However, in May 2013, the case took a dramatic turn. Prosecutors uncovered new evidence indicating Caitlin had violated the no-contact order. On the victim's confiscated iPod, authorities found over 20,000 text messages, audio files, and images. Many messages were emotional, romantic, and sometimes abusive. They included criticisms of the girl's parents, expressions of love and loyalty, and discussions of the investigation. Additionally, some messages suggested plans for secret meetings and efforts to communicate covertly through third parties, further complicating the situation. Jailhouse phone recordings revealed Caitlin discussing strategies to maintain contact with the girl despite the court order. In these conversations, Caitlin expressed frustration and heartbreak, but also defied the restrictions explicitly placed on her. With this new evidence, the prosecution withdrew the initial plea deal and filed additional charges, including transmission of materials harmful to a minor. These charges significantly increased Caitlin's legal jeopardy, undermining the defense's argument that her actions were a youthful mistake. Caitlin was arrested again. Her bail amount was increased, and the direction of the case underwent a significant change. It now appeared to prosecutors as a clear situation of someone intentionally violating court orders and laws, rather than a murky legal matter. Public opinion began to diverge. Many of those who initially supported the Free Kate movement remained loyal, but others expressed frustration with Caitlin's decisions after her arrest. The focus shifted from the nature of the relationship to Caitlin's defiance of legal boundaries and the court's authority. As the case drew to a close, the evidence included electronic communications, statements from both parties, and proof of continued contact after the initial arrest. What had started as an emotional and polarizing debate over age, intent, and relationships became a legal battle centered on compliance with the law. Caitlin's future, once full of promise with graduation and college prospects, now hung in limbo. A teenage romance had escalated into a high-stakes criminal case, fueled by emotion, public pressure, and cultural debates about justice. By late 2013, the case of the state of Florida versus Caitlin Hunt had grown far beyond the high school hallways into the national spotlight of the criminal justice system. The case attracted attention with various types of evidence. The charges continued to mount, and the courtroom became the deciding venue for a highly controversial case. Despite intense media attention and appeals for leniency, the legal process remained focused on the facts: the victim's age, the documented abusive relationship, and the thousands of messages proving that Caitlin had violated the no-contact order. To avoid a trial, which would force the minor to testify, introduce emotional evidence, and create further trauma for both families, both sides worked toward a plea agreement. A trial posed great risks for Caitlin. A conviction on all charges, including transmission of harmful materials, could result in up to 15 years in prison and mandatory abuse offender registration. On November 15, 2013, Caitlin Hunt appeared in court and accepted a revised plea agreement. She pleaded no contest to reduced charges, which included 2 counts of misdemeanor battery and 2 felonies related to violating the no-contact order. The plea deal spared her from prison time and lifetime registration as an abuse offender. Instead, her sentence consisted of 4 months in county jail, 2 years of house arrest with electronic monitoring, and another year of probation. She was also required to attend counseling, faced restrictions on internet and social media use, and remained under a strict no-contact order with the victim. The courtroom atmosphere was calm but serious. Dressed in plain clothes, Caitlin stood beside her attorney as the judge reviewed the plea terms. She answered only procedural questions with short, respectful replies. There were no dramatic statements or efforts to shift the narrative. The proceedings were formal and restrained, reinforcing that the case was being handled strictly within the bounds of the law. The prosecution briefly explained their reasoning for the agreement, noting the case's national attention, but emphasizing that the plea aligned with state sentencing guidelines, particularly for first-time offenders who accepted responsibility. They also stressed the importance of limiting further public attention on the victim. The defense expressed relief over the resolution, portraying Caitlin as a young woman who had acted emotionally, but not maliciously. They argued that she was neither a predator nor a continued threat to society, framing the case as a youthful mistake that had been amplified by legal technicalities and public scrutiny. The judge approved the plea agreement, confirming Caitlin had waived her right to trial and accepted the consequences of her actions. The sentence was finalized, and Caitlin was sent to the Indian River County Jail to begin her term, followed by the conditions of her release. No reporters were allowed in the courtroom, but news of the plea agreement quickly spread. For some, the sentence felt like a middle ground, a way to resolve a difficult situation without devastating Caitlin's future. For others, it underscored the seriousness of crossing legal boundaries, regardless of the circumstances. The proceedings concluded without drama. The defense did not challenge the central facts. The prosecution did not pursue the harshest penalties, and the court balanced the law, the evidence, and human considerations to reach its decision. When Caitlin began her jail term, the legal case officially came to a close. However, the ripple effects of the case continued. For her, The victim, their families, and the broader community that had followed every development. For Caitlin, the plea deal provided an opportunity to avoid prison and a lifetime on the abuse offender registry. But the impact of the case continued to affect her into adulthood. Her name remained linked to the case through online records and background checks. After serving her sentence and completing probation, she began the challenging process of moving forward, though her life remained shaped by a decision made at 18. What had seemed like a relationship rooted in young love resulted in lasting legal and personal consequences. The court orders prohibited her from contacting the victim, and any breach of these restrictions could bring further penalties. Her social media activity was monitored, and her career prospects and public reputation were permanently affected by her conviction. For the younger teen involved, whose identity was legally protected, the effects were largely private but no less profound. Although national attention surrounded the case, her story remained confidential. She avoided the public eye but endured the emotional toll. Her high school years were overshadowed by a case that thrust her life into a national spotlight, leaving her tethered to an event that had spiraled out of her control. The case sparked intense debate in American media and legal circles. Caitlin's supporters viewed it as an example of how rigid laws could unfairly criminalize typical teenage behavior. Critics, however, emphasized that the issue was not about sexual orientation or public opinion. It was about safeguarding minors under the law. The division in public opinion highlighted a larger cultural question. How should the legal system handle relationships between teens with age differences? Where should compassion end and accountability begin? Florida's Romeo and Juliet laws, designed to offer leniency in certain cases, did not apply here because of the age gap and timing. However, the national conversation that ensued prompted lawmakers, educators, and parents to reconsider how they approach topics like boundaries, consent, and responsibility with young people. It serves as a reminder that a personal relationship, when subjected to legal scrutiny, can become a pivotal moment not just for those involved, but for how society addresses such issues. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence. A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, none of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation. And finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, he said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. She had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control, causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wohlschlager was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier. However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wohlschlager would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. Jeffrey Marsalis, born in the 1970s and raised in Idaho, grew up in a state better known for its scenic mountains and ski resorts than national scandals. While not especially prominent, the Marsalis family was well regarded in the local community, appearing to be an average, stable, upper-middle-class household, quiet, tidy, and seemingly ordinary. From a young age, Jeffrey was seen as intelligent, composed, and self-assured. Teachers described him as clever, sometimes too clever, with a keen sense of observation that could inspire either admiration or suspicion. He wasn't outspoken, but he thrived on being persuasive, often taking on the role of a subtle performer. As a teenager, Jeffrey was athletic, clean-cut, and active in school organizations. He avoided trouble, maintained a clean criminal record, and always presented himself as polite to adults. His outward appearance and demeanor painted a picture of an ambitious young man, underestimated by some but clearly driven. After high school, Jeffrey pursued higher education and enrolled in nursing school. He chose a career in healthcare, a field grounded in trust and compassion, traits he effectively portrayed. He never completed an advanced degree, though his partial education helped him speak confidently about healthcare, impressing those less familiar with the field. In the early 2000s, Jeffrey moved to Philadelphia, a city full of educational institutions and professional opportunities. He rented a small apartment and began presenting himself as Dr. Jeff, weaving lies and truths together so seamlessly it was hard for others to discern reality. He constructed elaborate personas, portraying himself as a doctor, Navy officer, CIA agent, trauma surgeon, and even astronaut, tailoring his identity to suit his audience. His act was convincing, complete with props like stethoscopes, military gear, badges, NASA memorabilia, and forged documents, all reinforcing his false narratives. Jeffrey used online dating platforms like Match.com to extend his web of deception. His polished profile, featuring sharp photos and a veneer of sophistication, appealed to women seeking a successful, educated, and committed partner. He played the role flawlessly, presenting himself as the ideal match. To acquaintances, Jeffrey was a charismatic enigma. He could engage in discussions on a broad range of topics, from foreign policy to anatomy, military strategy, or romance, adjusting his charm based on his audience. He didn't come across as threatening, but rather as polished and intriguing. While he kept a low profile in public, he thrived in one-on-one interactions, where he dominated conversations and carefully controlled the narrative. Romantically, he had little trouble attracting partners. He claimed to be a doctor working at 3 of Philadelphia's top hospitals, a veteran of classified overseas missions, and a high-level intelligence operative with powerful connections in Washington. Although his stories were extravagant, his calm confidence often made people believe him. When questioned, he always had convincing explanations. Jeffrey told women he was restricted from sharing certain details due to national security concerns. His apartment featured just enough theatrics to make his stories believable: a fingerprint scanner on his computer, a CIA-themed screensaver, and files marked with terms like top secret or eyes only. To those meeting him for the first time, the combination of real-world elements and fantasy seemed plausible. However, beneath the facade, there were inconsistencies. He frequently changed jobs, showed little commitment to any single profession, and never finished his advanced education. His work history was inconsistent, but it didn't immediately raise suspicion. Jeffrey moved fluidly between social circles, blending in well enough to avoid scrutiny while standing out just enough to capture attention. When people met Jeffrey casually, they rarely noticed any discrepancies in his character. He appeared confident, successful, and composed, someone worth knowing. Women who went on dates with him often left impressed, feeling special and chosen. Jeffrey had a knack for quickly understanding people, figuring out what they wanted to hear, and delivering it. It wasn't just simple charm. It was a calculated strategy. Yet, behind his polished image, Jeffrey had no close friends and confided in no one. He was constantly on the move, reshaping his identity to fit the moment. Whether in Philadelphia or Idaho, the story was always the same: Dr. Jeff, a man with purpose, connections, and nothing that seemed worth questioning. But the truth was starkly different. Jeffrey was none of the things he claimed to be. He had no medical license, no military experience, and no credentials to support the image he meticulously curated. For years, no one saw through his act. He walked through life projecting the appearance of someone with it all together. Jeffrey controlled the narrative about himself. When women met him online, typically through Match.com, they believed him. He was polished, articulate, and educated, and low-key charming in a way that inspired trust. He didn't appear arrogant or controlling. On the contrary, he seemed caring, empathetic, and safe, But things were not as they seemed, and troubling patterns began to surface. Women who interacted with Jeffrey shared eerily similar stories. At first, he would send thoughtful messages and smoothly suggest meeting for drinks. Their first date often involved alcohol, wine, cocktails, or beer. He'd make engaging conversation, ask questions, and come across as a busy man truly invested in getting to know them. Each woman left feeling special, as though they'd been given a glimpse into his exciting, secretive life. The evening often ended with an invitation to his place or for just one more drink. Then everything went silent. All emotions stopped. Time passed, leaving behind an uneasy feeling. Many women reported waking up in an unfamiliar bed, naked, disoriented, and physically unwell. Sometimes Jeffrey was beside them. Other times, they were alone. Their clothing would be misarranged, their bodies would ache, and they'd have no memory of consenting, or even of what had happened. When they confronted him, he denied anything unusual. He would feign surprise or dismiss their concerns, saying that they had had too much to drink or that they had really been into it, and told them not to make it a big deal. Many people felt self-conscious, began to doubt themselves, tried to explain the situation, and hesitated to call the police. After all, Jeffrey was known as Dr. Jeff, a Navy veteran and trauma specialist. Who would believe otherwise about him? That all changed in 2005 when a young woman from Idaho, known as Jody, decided to speak up. Jody met Jeffrey while working at the Sun Valley Resort in Idaho, where he had relocated after initial allegations began to emerge in Philadelphia. At the resort, he worked as a security guard, not a doctor, but his lies continued. He claimed to be involved in military intelligence and hinted at a life filled with experiences most people couldn't imagine. Jody has no romantic interest in Jeffrey because she is openly gay. However, she accepts his invitation to have a drink as a friend because she believes she can trust him. That night, something went horribly wrong. After Jody left her beer unattended and later drank from it, she suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to leave, but Jeffrey insisted on walking her home. She eventually passed out. The next morning, she woke up naked in an unfamiliar room, vomiting and feeling physically violated. Her memories were fragmented, but her instincts told her something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Jeffrey acted as though nothing was wrong, calling her his little gay buddy and walking her back to her dorm. But Jody refused to ignore her intuition. She went to the hospital, contacted the police, and submitted to an abuse kit exam immediately. Unlike the women in Philadelphia, Jody had physical evidence, DNA and medical documentation that confirmed her story. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Special Victims Unit had already begun piecing together complaints against Jeffrey. Quiet investigations had started after one woman came forward months earlier. The more investigators dug, the more names emerged. Women from Match.com, as well as those he met socially, began to recount similar experiences. Over time, 21 women stepped forward, each with chillingly consistent accounts of how Jeffrey had deceived and harmed them. Detective Charlie Conway recalled the moment the pattern became evident. He said that those weren't isolated misunderstandings and that it was a clear and deliberate scheme. Evidence mounted when investigators found a spreadsheet on Jeffrey's computer titled Yearly Calendar of Women. It listed names, dates, places, and cryptic notes. A chilling record prosecutors believed documented his victims. In his Philadelphia apartment, police uncovered disturbing items: a bulletproof vest, a police baton, fake hospital IDs, medical equipment, and forged or stolen military and government documents, including Navy insignias and fake CIA credentials. Among his belongings were a fingerprint scanner and software imitating a classified government system. A framed NASA astronaut photo added to the collection of identities Jeffrey used to deceive. Victims' stories followed a similar pattern. They described going on dates that ended in blackouts, waking up with no memory of what happened. Many felt trapped in shame, confusion, and disorientation. Shockingly, some continued seeing him, caught in cycles of manipulation and trauma. Jeffrey used not just drugs, but psychological control, breaking down their ability to consent. Prosecutors have faced significant challenges. Many victims come forward months or even years after the attack, leaving behind little physical evidence, such as banned substance test results, abuse kits, or witnesses. Cases often rely heavily on victim testimony. While this testimony is reliable, it is often insufficient to meet the high standard of proof in criminal cases. The case took a turn in 2006. Jeffrey was arrested in Sun Valley, Idaho, after a woman named Jody reported him immediately. Her swift action, coupled with medical evidence from an abuse kit and visible injuries, strengthened the case against him. Authorities in Idaho collaborated with Philadelphia investigators, who were building their own case based on a pattern of accusations. When confronted, Jeffrey remained calm, denying all allegations. His defense attempted to cast him as a harmless ladies' man who was being targeted by regretful women. Prosecutors, however, focused on exposing his systematic deceit. In addition to charges of abuse and assault, Jeffrey also faced allegations of impersonating public officials, committing identity fraud, and obstructing justice. By masquerading as a doctor, soldier, or spy, he not only lured victims, but also used these personas to dominate and silence them. Meanwhile, victims began connecting with one another, forming a support network to share stories and timelines. Many said it was the first time they felt heard and validated. As Jeffrey awaited trial, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Over the years, he had meticulously planned his actions, refining his methods and keeping detailed records to avoid detection. Each victim thought she was alone, unaware of the full scope of his predation. By spring 2007, Jeffrey stood trial in a Philadelphia courtroom in one of the city's most disturbing serial abuse cases. Once regarded as a charismatic and educated professional, he is now facing charges, including abuse, from 7 separate victims. Despite this, the case posed challenges. Prosecutors had no physical evidence from the Philadelphia victims, no toxicology reports, no abuse kits, and no witnesses. What they did have were consistent, compelling testimonies from women who had never met each other, but shared the same harrowing stories. They described Jeffrey's charm, his offers of drinks, the unexplained blackouts, and waking up confused, violated, and ashamed. Assistant District Attorney Joe McGettigan built the case around this consistency, along with the damning spreadsheet found on Jeffrey's laptop. The yearly calendar of women provided names, dates, and chilling notes that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Jeffrey's fake identities, including a CIA badge, hospital IDs, and military props, used to manipulate and exploit his victims, one by one. The women testified. Many wept. Others trembled as they recounted their trauma. They spoke about sickness, helplessness, self-blame, and waking up disoriented with their clothes in disarray. Some admitted staying in touch with him afterward, explaining how psychological manipulation left them unable to confront their abuse. This emotional confusion became a focal point of the defense's argument. Defense attorney James Funt argued that all the encounters were consensual, claiming the accusers felt regret, not trauma. He highlighted the absence of timely police reports and pointed out inconsistencies in their recollections. The defense also noted the lack of medical evidence, arguing that in a case based solely on memories, doubt was unavoidable. Jeffrey sat silently in the courtroom, rarely showing emotion and occasionally smiling. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vendetta, targeted for his persona rather than his actions. His defense team insisted he never claimed to be a CIA agent or a doctor, arguing these were misunderstandings or exaggerations created by the women themselves. In March 2007, the verdict was announced. Jeffrey was acquitted of all charges except two, for which he was found guilty of abuse. His acquittal on the most serious charges shocked many, particularly the women who had risked everything to testify. While the partial conviction was a legal victory, it felt emotionally hollow. Jeffrey was released on bail. However, his legal troubles were far from over. In Idaho, Jeffrey faced a separate, much stronger case, built on physical evidence. In 2009, he was tried in Blaine County for the abuse of Jody, a 21-year-old woman who had immediately sought medical help and cooperated fully with law enforcement. This time, the prosecution had what was missing in Philadelphia: an abuse kit, DNA evidence, documented injuries, and a clear timeline. They presented expert witnesses and highlighted the consistency between Jody's account and stories told by women from the previous case. Jeffrey's history, detailed in his spreadsheet and patterns of behavior, was laid bare. Jody testified with precision, recounting the night she drank with Jeffrey, how she detected something granular in her beer, the disorientation that followed, and the terror of waking up naked beside him. Her testimony was clear, her fear undeniable. The defense once again argued that the encounter was consensual and claimed Jody had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury rejected their narrative. In 2009, Jeffrey was convicted of abuse in Idaho and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time, the justice system handed down a punishment that matched the severity of Jeffrey's crimes. Crimes many believed he had been committing for years. The courtroom in Idaho resounded with relief, a stark contrast to the frustration felt in Philadelphia 2 years earlier. Jeffrey's carefully constructed double life had crumbled. The man who once boasted about being a doctor, Navy SEAL, CIA operative, and even an astronaut, was now just another inmate. For the women who testified against him, the legal outcomes brought both vindication and lingering pain. In Philadelphia, his acquittal on the most serious charges devastated many. 21 women shared their stories, but their voices were not reflected in the final verdict. In Idaho, however, the guilty verdict and life sentence represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. For Jody, the survivor whose immediate actions and forensic evidence proved pivotal, it was more than a legal triumph, it was deeply personal. Her courage to speak out promptly and consistently made all the difference. Her case demonstrated what is possible when survivors are believed, supported, and protected by the justice system. The Jeffrey case stands as a chilling example of how image, privilege, and manipulation can allow someone to avoid accountability for years. He had no criminal record, dressed impeccably, and spoke with professionalism and authority. In a justice system often plagued by doubt and contradiction, these traits worked in his favor until they didn't. The case also reignited debates on how the legal system deals with dating abuse, especially when physical evidence is lacking. Prosecutors and victims' advocates highlighted the narrow definitions of proof and the challenges of pursuing cases where the weapon isn't a knife, but a drink. In court, women not only had to explain what happened to them, but were also scrutinized for how they reacted, how quickly they reported the crime, and whether their accounts were perfect enough to be believed. The case of Jeffrey Marsalis serves as a warning about the illusion of safety, how someone can be well-dressed, well-spoken, and still pose a threat. It underscores the cost of silence and the immense bravery required to come forward. Above all, it reminds us that predators don't always appear monstrous. Sometimes, they look like the man you met online, the one with the warm smile, whose story seemed just believable enough. Jeffrey's deception was widespread, but in the end, it wasn't enough to protect him. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green, His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand your ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De la Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case. But for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed. But the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. Sports often presents us with moments that go beyond the scoreboard, moments that reveal deeper, sometimes darker, aspects. This isn't about the game-winning shot, the championship, or the fairy tale. This is about a powerful man, a video that holds more secrets than the camera can capture, and a nation's reflection on the culture behind it. It all started as a normal basketball practice at Rutgers University. Sneakers clicked on the floor, whistles blared in the gym, young players busily practicing and chasing their dreams. At the center of it all was head coach Mike Rice, strong, authoritative, and fierce. But behind the walls of the gym, something unusual happened. A video emerged. It was grainy and low quality, but its contents were unmistakable. Coach Mike Rice yelling at players, throwing basketballs at their heads and groins, grabbing their jerseys, kicking them, and shouting profanities. His behavior was no longer encouragement or love, but outright abuse, captured in disturbing detail. Then came the slurs. Homophobic insults hurled across the gym, directed at teenage athletes. At Rutgers, where such language carried a painful history. The words cut deeper than any physical harm. When the video leaked to the public, it spread rapidly, sparking outrage. Parents, students, alumni, and people everywhere were appalled. Calls for Mike Rice's firing dominated news cycles. Politicians spoke out. Even comedy shows like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live mocked him. But beneath the satire, a serious conversation began to emerge. Was Mike Rice just a single bad coach? Or was his behavior evidence of a more systemic problem in sports culture? Up until then, Mike Rice was an obscure figure outside collegiate basketball. Overnight, he became a symbol of toxic coaching, unchecked power, and what happens when winning at all costs overshadows basic decency. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie voiced the nation's disbelief, saying that if Mike Rice had been Kobe Bryant's coach, he would have smacked the hell out of him. Soon, parents everywhere were asking a haunting question whether they would let that man coach their child. As the scandal erupted, Mike Rice vanished from the public eye, left to deal with the consequences, professionally, personally, and emotionally. He was fired, his reputation destroyed. At home, he faced his wife and children, knowing he had let them down. This story wasn't just about punishment. It became a reflection on anger, ego, toxic culture, and regret. And perhaps, in some ways, redemption. But if redemption was possible, it wouldn't come easily or quickly. Because some mistakes leave marks that time, and even apologies cannot erase. Before he became infamous as the coach who crossed the line, Mike Rice was just a kid who loved basketball. The sport was practically in his DNA. His mother had been a star college player, and his father, Mike Rice Sr., was a former coach and well-known NBA broadcaster. Mike Sr. was famously fiery, so much so that he remains the only NBA broadcaster ever ejected from a game, tossed out for arguing with a referee from the announcer's table. In the Rice household, basketball wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. The game shaped family dinners, fueled debates, and ignited passion. It wasn't seen as toxic. It was simply part of who they were. Mike Rice seemed destined to follow in his family's footsteps. He played college basketball and slowly climbed the coaching ladder. His journey was not an overnight success. Starting at smaller programs, he moved from assistant coaching roles to head coach positions, earning a reputation for relentless effort and intense dedication to the game. He was focused, determined, hungry. However, unchecked intensity can sometimes take a darker turn. Mike got his first taste of success at Robert Morris University, a small school in western Pennsylvania, where he transformed a struggling basketball team into a winner. Under his leadership, Robert Morris enjoyed a 3-year winning streak and earned a spot in the NCAA tournament. His energy and intensity were central to this turnaround. Practices were tough, often harder than the games. Mike believed that this pressure would build resilience, pushing his players to, and sometimes beyond, their limits. In the small school environment, with less media scrutiny and fewer critics, Mike's demanding style flourished. But success brought attention, and in 2010 he was hired as the head basketball coach at Rutgers University. Along with a 6-figure salary, Mike was given a daunting task to transform the struggling program in one of the country's premier conferences, the Big East. The pressure was immense. Rutgers had been stuck at the bottom of the Big East standings for years, and the program needed revitalization. Mike promised to provide that spark. At first, he appeared to deliver, injecting new energy and demanding more from his players. But away from the public eye, his intense methods started to raise concerns. At home, Mike's wife, Kathy, picked up on warning signs early: his language, anger, and emotional outbursts. She frequently addressed it with him, but the behavior didn't change. In Mike's mind, his methods weren't abusive. They were meant to prepare players for the harsh realities of basketball and life. He believed his intensity built toughness. To him, if his players couldn't handle his criticism, how would they handle high-pressure moments in games? He failed to realize he had already crossed a line on the court. Mike's temper became more apparent. He often yelled at referees, berated players, and even drew technical fouls. During one particularly heated game against Louisville, Mike was ejected. Alarmed by his behavior, the director asked him why. If he was such a great coach, he kept embarrassing the university. Mike saw it differently. Later, he said that he hadn't had an anger problem and that it was a myth. He explained that he had a control problem and had lost control, emphasizing that there was a difference. However, he ignored warnings from his wife, his bosses, and even his assistant coaches, all of whom had tried to curb his destructive behavior. Driven by his ambition to prove himself, Mike became increasingly tunnel-visioned, losing sight of the purpose of coaching. For a time, Mike's methods were overlooked because winning seemed to matter more than how he achieved it. Rutgers didn't fire him, choosing instead to wait and hope his behavior would improve. However, behind the scenes, someone was already taking action. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and assistant coach at Rutgers, had collaborated closely with Mike for many years. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric's contract, he made a fateful decision, reviewing hours of internal practice footage, a public record since Rutgers is a state school. Eric compiled the worst examples of Mike's abusive behavior into a video and handed it over to the administration. That act set off a countdown to Mike's firing and the national scandal that would follow. Mike Rice came to Rutgers in 2010 as an unpolished but hungry coach who had transformed a small program into a winner. Unlike coaches with prestigious backgrounds or legendary mentors, Mike was scrappy and determined to prove he belonged. In a college sports culture fixated on immediate success, that hunger was enough for him to land the job. Rutgers needed change. After years of failure, the program had lost its fan base, student support, and financial backers. Mike promised to reignite passion, deliver results, and break the team out of its slump. At first, it appeared he might succeed, but his harmful methods ultimately overshadowed any progress he had made. From day one, he attacked his job with urgency. His approach was intense. He pushed players relentlessly, shouting and demanding more, never satisfied. He wasn't a quiet or constructive coach. Instead, he screamed, cursed, and berated. Miss a defensive rotation, you'd get an earful. Fail a drill, you'd run it again and again, until you collapsed. Initially, some players respected his intensity, believing he was toughening them up, preparing them for pressure and the realities of life. They would say that was just how the coach was, and that he was old school. But his old school methods quickly crossed the line, repeatedly and behind closed doors. In the practice facility, his behavior escalated. He threw basketballs at players, sometimes at their legs, sometimes at their heads. He shoved them, yanked their jerseys, and hurled slurs, using homophobic insults like faggots, fairies, and sissies. He mocked and humiliated players. This wasn't an occasional lapse. It was systematic and ongoing abuse. This wasn't leadership. This was assault disguised as coaching. And the worst part, everyone saw it. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and respected figure in basketball, joined Mike's staff as the director of player development. At first, he supported Mike's vision, but what he witnessed shocked him. Disturbed, Eric started documenting the abuse. As a public university, Rutgers recorded all official team practices and stored the video footage. Eric sifted through hours of archived tape, compiling a reel of damning evidence. That reel would ultimately expose everything. But within the program, a toxic culture protected Mike. Despite numerous complaints, warnings, and internal reviews, no one stopped him. The athletic department knew. The university president knew. Some staff members spoke out, but their concerns were dismissed or ignored. Why? Because firing a head coach wasn't just a disciplinary decision, it was a financial one. Mike's contract included a substantial buyout. Firing him could cost Rutgers over $1 million. So they tried to manage the issue quietly, issuing a fine, suspending him for a few games, and requiring anger management classes. They gave no public explanation, no transparency. Meanwhile, the players were trapped. Many were on scholarships. Their future opportunities depended on staying in the coach's good graces. Speaking out could mean losing playing time, support, or even their spot on the team. Some transferred to other schools. Some stayed silent. A few tried to justify what was happening. The abuse continued. Mike didn't think he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he was molding boys into men. Breaking them down would make them stronger. He saw himself as tough but fair. Having grown up in a household where yelling was normal and passion was loud, he didn't believe he was crossing any lines, but he ignored the signals. His staff's concerns, his family's warnings, and the quiet suffering of his players. Mike's wife, Kathy, had been begging him to change for years. After games, she would point to footage on TV, showing him his rage-filled face and choice of words. She urged him to think about their children, who were starting to hear rumors. But Mike dismissed her. In his mind, his methods would be validated by results. But the results weren't coming. Rutgers wasn't improving. Mike's win-loss record remained unimpressive, and the pressure on him grew. Boosters demanded more success. The athletic department became uneasy. With every outburst, he became harder to defend. And then, things finally reached a breaking point, after Rutgers chose not to renew Eric Murdoch's contract. He handed over the practice footage he had compiled to the athletic department again. This time, he delivered a clear ultimatum if action wasn't taken. He would make sure the footage became public. For months, no action was taken. Then, on April 2nd, 2013, ESPN's Outside the Lines released the footage to the public. What followed left America stunned. The videos revealed Rutgers basketball coach Mike Rice cursing, throwing balls at players' heads, hurling slurs, and physically grabbing athletes mid-practice. These weren't isolated incidents. The footage included dozens of clips, spliced together. They painted a horrifying picture of a coach completely out of control. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Social media exploded. News outlets replayed the footage non-stop. Sports radio slammed Rutgers for protecting Mike. Journalists began questioning who knew about the abuse and when. Students protested. Alumni threatened to cut off donations. Parents of players expressed their outrage, Within 24 hours, Mike Rice was fired, but the damage had already been done. The scandal quickly escalated. Rutgers athletic director Tim Pernetti, who had decided not to fire Mike earlier, resigned. The university's general counsel stepped down. The president of Rutgers faced intense criticism. Everyone involved in keeping the abuse under wraps was now under investigation. This was no longer just about Mike. It exposed deeper issues within college athletics. A culture that prioritized winning over player welfare. A system where money outweighed morality. A tradition where young athletes, many still teenagers, were expected to stay silent about mistreatment. Mike disappeared from public view, becoming synonymous with disgrace. Many of his players moved on, though some carried emotional scars from their time under his volatile leadership. Some forgave him, but others refused to speak with him again. In the following months, Mike sought help. He entered anger management, met with therapists, and began volunteering with high schools and youth sports leagues. He tried to rebuild himself and his reputation, quietly and slowly, but for many, it was far too late. The footage couldn't be erased, and the memories of his behavior couldn't be unseen. The scandal revealed what Mike was really like behind closed doors, who he truly was when no one was supposed to be watching. Mike built his career on fiery intensity, but ultimately destroyed it through cruelty. The same culture that once celebrated his passion was now responsible for his fall. In early April 2013, the footage went viral. Grainy practice clips shot inside Rutgers' basketball facility were broadcast nationwide by ESPN's Outside the Lines. Within hours, the videos were everywhere, on Twitter, Facebook, news channels, and YouTube. Almost overnight, it seemed like the entire country had seen what was never meant to be public. No narration or commentary was necessary. The footage said it all. The clips showed Mike stalking the gym floor, his face red with rage and veins bulging as he screamed insults. He hurled basketballs at players with force. One incident showed a ball bouncing off a player's head, another ricocheting off a leg. The videos captured him lunging at players, grabbing them, and shouting slurs like faggots, sissies, and motherfuckers. Every word echoed like a weapon in the gym. This was far more than intensity. It was outright abuse, and the entire world saw it, from homes to dorm rooms to break rooms across the nation. People watched the footage in disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others turned away, while some replayed the video just to reassure themselves they hadn't misinterpreted what they saw. The media responded immediately. Overnight, Mike became a national disgrace. He wasn't just a bad coach. He was that coach, the one who bullied and humiliated his players on camera. ESPN analysts dissected the video. Late-night comedians mocked him, and public figures joined in to condemn him. Famous athletes like Charles Barkley, LeBron James, and Magic Johnson weighed in. Even coaches known for their strictness and discipline agreed that Mike had crossed every line imaginable. The fallout continued at Rutgers. Within a day of the footage going public, the university was in chaos. The outcry was deafening. Students protested in the streets of New Brunswick, demanding accountability. Outraged parents called into local radio stations, furious that their children had been subjected to Mike's treatment. Alumni threatened to end their financial support of the university. The scandal had spilled far beyond the gym. It wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about the broken culture of college sports. The phones at the president's office were ringing non-stop. Reporters set up camp outside the athletic department. Board members scrambled to hold emergency meetings. At the center of the chaos was Tim Pernetti, the athletic director who had seen the footage months earlier. but chose not to fire Mike Rice. It was soon obvious that this wasn't a case of a university blindsided by new revelations. Rutgers had already known. The video had been submitted months prior, and internal meetings had taken place. Mike had been suspended for 3 games, fined $75,000, and ordered to attend anger management. But the video itself was kept under wraps. Now, that decision seemed like a deliberate cover-up. Tim Pernetti released a public statement saying that he had always tried to do what was right. But in that case, he regretted not taking stronger action sooner. His statement did little to control the damage, but by then, the damage was done. The entire Rutgers athletic program was under intense scrutiny. Critics questioned the university's leadership, its values, and the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Even New Jersey Governor Chris Christie weighed in, calling the video footage appalling and stating Mike should have been fired immediately. The scandal reached beyond Rutgers, prompting colleges nationwide to re-examine their policies and oversight. If such behavior could happen and be documented at Rutgers, what might be happening behind closed doors elsewhere? Meanwhile, Eric Murdoch, the whistleblower who turned in the tape, sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a hero for exposing the toxic culture, while others accused him of acting out of spite after his contract wasn't renewed. Eric dismissed the accusations, saying in interviews that he hadn't done it for revenge, but because he believed it was wrong. He stated that what Mike did to those players was not how human beings should be treated. As the media frenzy slightly subsided in the weeks that followed, the consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. Former players' parents began speaking out, revealing that their sons came home emotionally drained. Some admitted they had advised their children to stay quiet, not wanting to risk losing their scholarships. Other players, like former Rutgers guard Derek Randall, shared first-hand accounts of how Mike's abusive behavior left lasting scars. Some players defended Mike, saying he pushed them to improve and wasn't a bad person. But the footage painted a stark picture. The line had been crossed, time and time again. As for Mike, he eventually broke his silence in a televised interview, admitting that he had been wrong. He said he had no excuse, that he had lost control, let his emotions take over, and let down the people he cared about most. Mike didn't try to justify his behavior or shift blame. He acknowledged that he had failed as a leader, and he said the most painful part of it all was facing his children's disappointment. Mike described his therapy sessions as the most difficult experience of his life. Week after week, he was forced to watch the tape, not as a coach, but as a father, husband, and human being. Over time, Mike Rice started volunteering with youth basketball programs. He led clinics, mentored young players, and gave speeches about emotional control and the power of words. Some viewed these actions as genuine growth, while others saw them as an attempt to repair his reputation. Regardless of intent, the scandal cast a lasting shadow. The Rutgers basketball program struggled to recover. Recruiting efforts faltered, players transferred, morale plummeted, and the university spent years working to rebuild trust with students, families, and donors alike. The NCAA, already criticized for other issues, faced renewed scrutiny over its lack of oversight and the treatment of student athletes. Lawmakers pushed for reforms aimed at protecting athletes from abusive coaching. Some schools introduced stricter reporting systems, while others quietly re-examined their own programs, hoping to avoid a similar controversy. Yet despite these reforms, one fundamental truth remained no policy. Training, or code of conduct, can stop abuse without individuals stepping up to confront it when they see it. The Rutgers case wasn't just about a coach losing his temper. It exposed a system that enabled and protected him while silencing those who tried to speak out. Mike didn't just betray his players. The institution failed them as well. That's why the video was so shocking. It wasn't just the disturbing footage. It was the years of silence, excuses, fear, money, and a toxic culture that allowed this behavior to thrive behind closed doors. In a televised interview, Mike issued a public apology, not to save his career, which was nearly destroyed, but to explain what had driven him to that point. He admitted that he had been out of control and that he had let his competitive drive override his values. He also confessed that he had coached through fear and anger, and that wasn't the kind of person he wanted to be. He didn't cry or plead for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he took responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the pain he caused, especially to his players. Still, many remained skeptical. Some dismissed his remorse as calculated and insincere, a case of too little, too late. After all, how could someone who hurled slurs one year claim personal transformation the next? Former players were divided. Some privately spoke of enduring trauma, panic attacks, mistrust of authority, and memories of practices burned into their minds. Others defended Mike, arguing that he never intended harm and had helped them grow tougher and more focused. Yet even his supporters couldn't ignore the undeniable truth captured on video. This wasn't speculation. It was documented abuse. Rutgers didn't forgive him. The NCAA didn't welcome him back. No other programs reached out. His name became toxic. Parents didn't want him around their kids. Colleges avoided dealing with the questions his presence would raise. So Mike started over. Not with college athletes, but with kids. He began volunteering at youth basketball camps, arriving in old sneakers and a simple t-shirt, no fancy title, no paycheck, just a whistle, a gym full of middle schoolers, and a chance to begin again with those too young to know the scandal. He taught them drills and ran warm-ups. He shared stories but also spoke about emotions, pressure, and how yelling isn't leadership. He reminded the kids that their worth wasn't tied to how many points they scored, but how they treated their teammates. Over time, some parents began to trust him with their kids. A few stayed wary, keeping their distance. But Mike wasn't asking for redemption. He just kept showing up. Back home, his wife, Kathy, stayed by his side. She had always been his voice of reason. While she didn't excuse his actions, she didn't leave him. Their family, deeply affected by the public shame, focused on healing. Their son, once teased and humiliated at school, began talking about forgiveness. Their daughter, who initially refused to watch the footage, started attending clinics again. This time, she saw her father differently, not as the man who lost control, but someone working to regain it. Still, the past lingered. In gyms or grocery stores, people sometimes recognized him. They whispered, pointed fingers, and occasionally confronted him. Some stayed silent, offering only a look that said everything. Mike didn't argue or make excuses in those moments, but acknowledged it, telling a friend that he had earned that and all he could do now was try to be better. As the years went by, the scandal faded from public attention. Headlines focused on new controversies, new scandals, and new villains. But for Mike, it never really ended. It stayed with him in therapy sessions, family dinners, and the quiet moments at kids' basketball camps between drills. He never coached college basketball again. He didn't aim for national recognition. He never even tried. Instead, he kept rebuilding, not for public opinion or media redemption, but for the people closest to him, the ones he faced every day, the ones who mattered the most. This wasn't about fixing his reputation. It was about accepting responsibility. And that is the difference between regret and true remorse. The Mike scandal didn't end with his firing. It sparked a reckoning. It forced college athletics to reevaluate the line between being a tough coach and being abusive. It revealed how some institutions prioritize image over accountability. It reminded everyone that behind every player, behind every jersey and scholarship, is a human being who deserves respect, not just discipline. Mike never returned to the college basketball stage. His name remains tied to a pivotal moment when private misconduct was dragged into public view. His story didn't fade, though. It exists in policy changes, coaching workshops, and in the tougher questions administrators now ask about what happens out of public sight. For his former players, the story leaves a personal legacy. Some carry scars, some carry lessons, but all lived through a moment that reshaped the sport and their coach. For Mike, redemption isn't a goal to achieve. It's a lifelong process of repair. The tape doesn't lie, but what a person does after the tape stops, how they take responsibility, how they change. That's the part that's harder to see. On the surface, November 18th, 2010 looked like a normal Thursday morning in suburban Atlanta. The sky was clear, the air calm, and families were caught up in their usual morning routines, preparing lunches and hurrying to drop the kids off at school. In the Snyderman household, Rusty Snyderman was doing just that. After breakfast with his family, he kissed his wife goodbye, loaded his 2-year-old son Ian into the car, buckled him in, and drove to Dunwoody Prep, a small daycare center in a safe, middle-class neighborhood. Rusty, 36 years old, is a Harvard graduate entrepreneur. He has built a stable and successful life for his wife, Andrea, and their 2 children, Ian and Sophia. Friends described him as charming, loyal, energetic, and endlessly optimistic. He took great pride in his role as a father, always present and enthusiastic in caring for his children. But as he walked Ian into daycare that morning, an unseen danger was stalking him after dropping Ian off and exchanging pleasantries with other parents. Rusty made his way back to his car. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A man emerged, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet struck Rusty in the neck, and he collapsed onto the asphalt as horrified parents and teachers froze in shock. Blood surrounded him as he lay motionless. He didn't scream or struggle. It was an abrupt, calculated killing. The shooter then calmly walked back to his silver van and drove away. Rusty died instantly, just steps from the daycare playground. Close enough for the children to hear, but his son Ian remained inside, safe and unaware that he'd just said goodbye to his father for the last time. The city of Dunwoody was in shock. Who would carry out such a bold and brutal murder in broad daylight? In front of children, and why? Who could want Rusty dead? As investigators delved into Rusty's life, they uncovered a web of secrets darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. It was a story entangled with infidelity, manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, murder. The truth unveiled a world where appearances were deceiving and no one could be trusted. Rusty Snyderman was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a close-knit, loving Jewish family. From an early age, he was marked by charm, humor, and kindness. As the youngest in his family, Rusty grew up surrounded by love, high expectations, and strong traditions. He thrived academically, But his greatest gift was the way he made others feel valued and understood. By his teenage years, Rusty had developed a knack for leadership. He organized school events, volunteered, and built enduring friendships. Success wasn't his sole pursuit. He earned respect through his compassion and determination. After graduating high school, Rusty went on to Indiana University, where he formed a lifelong bond with Josh Gollum, one of his closest friends. It was during these college years that Rusty's life took a defining turn. One evening, after a relaxing night out, Rusty meets a wonderful girl, Andrea Robin Greenberg. She is smart, ambitious, and very beautiful, and Rusty is instantly attracted to her. Their bond was intense from the start. Their relationship deepened quickly, with friends noting how hard and fast Rusty had fallen for her. After graduating, Rusty pursued an MBA at Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious programs in the nation. He worked relentlessly, motivated by his dream of building a stable and meaningful life for his future family. After earning his degree, he married Andrea, and they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to create the life they had long envisioned. Rusty embarked on a career in finance, eventually becoming a trusted wealth manager and business consultant. His clients valued his expertise, and his colleagues respected him. Rusty approached his work with integrity, prioritizing relationships over transactions. When Andrea gave birth to their daughter Sophia, followed by their son Ian, Rusty's sense of purpose deepened. In the suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody, the Snydermans were viewed as the picture-perfect American family. They were kind, friendly, and actively involved in the community. The kind of neighbors everyone was glad to have. Rusty took pride in their home and the life he and Andrea had built together. He adored Andrea and fully supported her aspirations. When Andrea decided to rejoin the workforce after spending time at home with their children, Rusty stood by her wholeheartedly. He encouraged her to apply for a position at General Electric GE, where she became a project manager and reported directly to a senior executive named Hemi Newman. Andrea's new job required frequent travel, including conferences, business trips, and late-night meetings. Rusty willingly took on more parenting responsibilities and remained proud of her achievements, confident in their relationship. But over time, things began to change. Andrea's travel increased, and she appeared more distracted and distant. Rusty still tried to support her, but it was hard for him to ignore some of the signs, like the late-night phone calls, the vague explanations, and the change in her demeanor. Despite these red flags, Rusty remained silent. He trusted Andrea and believed in the life they had built. Unbeknownst to Rusty, Andrea's professional relationship with her boss, Hemi Newman, had crossed a line. Hemi had grown infatuated with her, and their work lives began to overlap with their personal ones. At the time, Rusty was focused on his children and career. To outsiders, the Snydermans seemed like a stable, happy family. Behind closed doors, however, a dangerous dynamic was forming, one Rusty was entirely unaware of. The tragedy that followed didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with trust. Trust from a man who loved deeply, valued loyalty, and centered his life on family. Rusty had a thriving career, 2 beloved children, and a wife he deeply cherished. His life was full of meaning and joy, yet all of it would be snatched away in a devastating instant. The man responsible had already entered their lives. Hemi Newman wasn't someone who instantly raised red flags. On paper, he is an experienced, intelligent engineer who takes on a leadership role at General Electric Energy in Atlanta, where he manages more than 5,000 employees. Colleagues described him as intelligent, confident, and occasionally arrogant. But beneath his polished facade, Hemi was unraveling. Though married with 2 children, his personal life was far from stable. Outwardly, he seemed successful, but privately, he was grappling with unhappiness. His marriage was crumbling, financial stress was mounting, and he appeared emotionally lost. His wife began to suspect him when he became cold, irritable, and unapproachable. And then, Andrea entered his life. Andrea Snyderman stood out at GE from the beginning. She was attractive, confident, and articulate. A woman who excelled in meetings, traveled seamlessly, and carried herself with ease. She laughed freely and admired Hemi in a way that felt absent in his own marriage, and he became captivated by her. Initially, Hemi and Andrea's relationship was purely business. However, over time, it evolved. First subtly, then intensely. They spent countless hours collaborating on presentations, attending conferences, and often sharing meals or drinks at hotel bars after meetings. Their work travels took them to places like Lake Tahoe, Denver, London, and even Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. To those around them, their connection seemed far more personal than business-related. Andrea later denied having an affair. She claimed that Hemi's feelings were unrequited, that she only saw him as a friend, and any closeness was misinterpreted. However, others have a different perspective. According to them, this relationship is emotional, flirtatious, and sometimes goes further, beyond work boundaries. Meanwhile, Rusty remained oblivious. Though aware of Andrea's frequent travel, he trusted her deeply. However, in the days leading up to his murder, Rusty grew uneasy. He noticed a suspicious man lingering near their home, a man wearing a hat, a fake mustache, and earmuffs. Alarmed by the man's presence, Rusty called 911. Rusty mentioned to the operator that he thought the man had a gun in his back pocket. His voice was steady but anxious, as he explained that he didn't know who the man was, but emphasized that he didn't want the man near his house. What Rusty couldn't know was that the stranger outside was Hemi, in disguise, preparing to kill him. 8 days later, Hemi followed Rusty to the Dunwoody Prep Daycare Center, where Hemi shot him at point-blank range in front of horrified parents and teachers. How did a successful and respected executive become a murderer? The answer reveals disturbing complexities. In police custody, Hemi confessed to the murder but claimed that he wasn't in control of his actions. He explained that he suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. One voice, resembling Barry White, urged him to kill himself. Investigators were shocked. Hemi's calm demeanor during the interrogation added to their unease. Despite his claims of mental illness, he appeared composed, methodical, and even rehearsed. While admitting to the crime, he attempted to frame it as a result of psychological turmoil. Throughout the interrogation, one name kept surfacing: Andrea. Hemi told police that he was in love with her, believing they were soulmates. He described how she confided in him about her troubled marriage, and how their emotional connection gave him hope for a future together. Andrea, however, denied any romantic involvement. She stated that Hemi had overstepped boundaries, making unwanted advances, which she had firmly rejected. She maintained that she only saw him as a colleague, but Hemi's phone records contradicted her claims. In the 6 months leading up to Rusty's murder, Andrea and Hemi exchanged more than 1,400 calls and text messages. Their emails suggested emotional, if not romantic, intimacy. In one such email, Hemi even proposed marriage. Andrea dismissed this as silly and inappropriate, testifying that she had told him to stop and made it clear his advances were unwelcome. Yet, She had allowed him into her hotel room during work trips, traveled alone with him, confided in him, arranged to pick him up from the airport, and even moved her seat on planes to sit beside him. She never mentioned any of this to Rusty. Hemi's wife, Ariella Newman, also felt that the relationship was not strictly professional. Ariella eventually filed for separation, but by then, it was too late. Hemi had already purchased the .40 caliber handgun that would ultimately end Rusty's life. A gun dealer later testified that Hemi had approached him, claiming he needed a firearm for home protection. After the murder, Hemi contacted the same dealer again, this time to ask about how to dispose of the gun for the police. It became evident that Hemi's obsession had taken a dark and deadly turn. As investigators assembled the case, one key question remained: was he acting alone? Did Andrea manipulate Hemi into murdering her husband? Did she feed his delusions, fuel his obsession, and make him believe that her husband Rusty was the only obstacle keeping them apart? Or was she an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of a man spiraling out of control? Andrea had claimed she didn't know Rusty had been shot until she arrived at the hospital, around 11 a.m., but phone records showed she had called Rusty's father at 9:36 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the shooting, and told him that Rusty had been shot. How did she know no one had told her? Police hadn't released that information yet. Her own testimony contradicted what she had told Rusty's family. Rusty's father would later testify in court, visibly emotional, confirming that Andrea had called and said that Rusty had been shot and that she was heading to Dunwoody Prep to find out what had happened. If Andrea didn't know, why would she say that? Prosecutors were beginning to suspect that Andrea wasn't just a grieving widow. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger. But had she played a part? As Hemi sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators uncovered more receipts, rental records, gun purchases. By January 2011, Hemi was charged with murder. But the question hanging over the case was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. The real question was who else knew. More than a year after the murder of Rusty Snyderman, the case finally arrived in a courtroom. The DeKalb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, legal observers, family members all watched as the man accused of gunning down a young father at a daycare center stood trial. Hemi had confessed to pulling the trigger. Now, he wasn't fighting to prove he was innocent. He was fighting to prove he was insane. At the center of the defense strategy was one claim: Hemi wasn't in his right mind when he murdered Rusty. He was mentally ill, lost in delusions, manipulated by voices, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty due to insanity. The prosecution, however, contended the opposite. He was sane, calculated, and dangerously obsessed. This was not a breakdown. It was a betrayal fueled by infatuation and selfish desire. During opening statements, the courtroom heard a bizarre explanation that completely changed the way the trial was perceived. Hemi's lawyers said he had been hearing voices for weeks before the murder. One deep, masculine voice, like Barry White's, repeatedly encouraged him to kill himself. Meanwhile, another soft, gentle voice, like Olivia Newton-John, instructed him to kill Rusty, saying that Rusty was a danger to his children. Hemi claimed that he truly believed he was protecting the Rusty's children. The story was so bizarre that it seemed beyond belief. The jury was silent, and even seasoned reporters could not hide their disbelief. A psychiatrist testified that Hemi suffered from bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was experiencing a manic, delusional episode when he committed the crime. Another expert supported this diagnosis, stating that Hemi's grip on reality had been unraveling for months, but the prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. To them, the voices were a fabrication, a calculated act. They didn't see a man spiraling out of control. They saw someone meticulously planning a murder, renting a car under a false identity, donning a disguise, driving across town, waiting, shooting, leaving. All of it pointed to premeditation. The prosecution also highlighted how Hemi deceived those around him. To them, this wasn't about mental illness. It was about jealousy, rejection, and unfulfilled desire. They argued that the true motivation behind the murder wasn't insanity. It was Andrea. The tension in the courtroom peaked when Andrea took the stand. She appeared different from before, polished and distant. Some described her as composed, while others saw arrogance in her demeanor. Andrea was asked directly if she had ever been romantically involved with Hemi, and she replied that she had not. The prosecution was prepared for this response. They presented a series of emails filled with emotionally charged messages. In one, Hemi pleaded with her to marry him. Others described shared moments, stargazing, waking up together in Denver, and walking hand in hand in Edinburgh. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, claiming that he had been infatuated, that she had tried to handle it, and that she had never encouraged it. Her testimony, however, only raised more questions. She admitted to letting Hemi into her hotel room during work trips, but maintained it was always innocent. She also admitted she never told her husband, Rusty, about Hemi's advances. Even after realizing Hemi had feelings for her, she continued to travel with him, sit beside him on flights, and take his late-night calls. The boundary between professional and personal was hopelessly blurred. When questioned about why she hadn't disclosed the nature of her relationship with Hemi to the police, Andrea said she didn't think it was relevant. But that explanation didn't sit well, neither with the prosecution nor the jury. Suspicion deepened when Rusty's father testified that Andrea had called him less than 30 minutes after the shooting and said Rusty had been shot, a fact that hadn't yet been made public. Andrea had previously claimed she didn't know about the shooting until she arrived at the hospital. Her timeline didn't add up. The prosecution seized on this inconsistency. If Andrea knew about the shooting before anyone told her, how did she know? Did Hemi warn her in advance? Did she already know it was going to happen? These questions hung heavily in the courtroom, unsettling the jury. The murder case with signs of insanity initially seemed simple, but then it became much more complicated and confusing. The defense reminded the jury that this trial was not about Andrea. Hemi was the one facing a life sentence. They repeatedly focused on Hemi's troubled past, including an abusive father and years of emotional instability. The defense argued that while Andrea may have been emotionally careless, it was Hemi who ultimately lost control. The prosecution, however, was relentless. In their closing arguments, they portrayed Hemi not as psychotic, but as calculated. They ridiculed the suggestion that voices compelled Hemi to act, mocking the idea that hearing songs by Barry White and Olivia Newton-John could justify a premeditated murder. The jury swiftly arrived at a verdict after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimony. Hemi Newman was declared guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Andrea called the verdict a relief and described her late husband, Rusty, as an amazing man. Yet the trial had permanently altered how the public viewed her. The inconsistent testimony, coupled with her behavior and relationship with Hemi, her husband's killer, created a lingering suspicion that she could not shake. Justice came with complications. Hemi Newman would spend the rest of his life in prison, held responsible for killing Rusty Snyderman while grappling with mental illness. For Rusty's family, the verdict brought some sense of closure, but true peace remained elusive. Andrea was never charged with murder. Although she was initially charged, prosecutors later dropped the most serious charges because there was not enough evidence to clearly and convincingly prove her involvement. Instead, she was convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying under oath and misleading investigators. She served time in prison, but not for her husband's death. The case left a lasting impact. A father was killed in cold blood outside his child's daycare. His murderer was consumed by an obsession with another man's wife, and Andrea, at the heart of it all, faced a lifetime of skepticism in the court of public opinion.